Welcome to the Fundamentals of Sound. My name is Samori Coles, and in this presentation, we'll be discussing how sound works, history of recording, and also how understanding sound better will make you a more effective audio engineer, both in your home studios and in your commercial studios. So let's get started. What is recording? Recording is capturing sound for future playback and/or processing. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. It doesn't really matter what technology or medium that you use for recording, but the principle of recording is that you capture sound so that you can play it back at a later date and/or process it, meaning add effects or add compression or add equalization or manipulate that sound in some way. Recording has advanced tremendously since its inception. The first device that could record sound mechanically but could not play it back was the phonautograph, which was developed in 1857 by Edward Leon Scott de Martinville. Now, if you take a look at the phonautograph, it basically had a horn and someone would speak into the open end of the horn. The sound would travel through the horn. And at the base of that horn was a stylus or a needle that would make contact with a cylinder that had a sheet of tin around it or a coating of tin. And so as the vibrations came into the horn, they would be etched into the tin. Now, this would happen while someone else was turning the crank arm that was also connected to the tin cylinder. This is how early recording was done. And as archaic as this seems, this was a significant achievement and advancement at the time. And again, the drawback of the phonautograph was that it could not play sound back. Now, in 1877, while seeking to improve the telephone, Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, which he patented in 1878. This was the first working recording device. And the technology of the phonograph is quite similar to the technology of the phonautograph, with some slight differences. The horn was smaller, but the idea of the tin cylinder was the same, and the crank arm that would actually be used to rotate the cylinder. The first words that were ever recorded were "Mary had a little lamb." And if you Google Thomas Edison, "Mary Had a Little Lamb," you'll be able to hear Thomas Edison recording these words on an early phonograph. In 1887, the gramophone was invented by Emil Berliner. The gramophone used a non-wax disc with lateral cut grooves to capture sound. And the first singers were recorded in 1893 on a gramophone. And this is where we get the term Grammy Awards. It is named after the gramophone. But if you take a look at the gramophone, there was a lateral cut disc. It was non-wax that would also rotate. And a needle or stylus would make contact with this disc and etch into the disc vibrations that came from the open end of the horn. And this was a pretty significant improvement, particularly when Emil Berliner added a spring motor to the gramophone. And so this allowed the gramophone to rotate at consistent revolutions per minute. And again, this offered the opportunity then to record singers and ultimately record music. And this is where we get, once again, the Grammy Awards. In 1928, Fritz Flumer, a German, received a patent for the magnetophone, and this was the first tape-based or analog recording device. This also was a significant achievement because the medium changed for recording. And magnetic tape basically is 4 pieces of very, very thin material stacked on top of each other. One layer of the tape is coated with magnetic oxide, which are the smallest known magnets. When a recording is made, the magnets reorient themselves in order to reproduce what's being recorded. And this is where we get analog analog tape recording. The audio cassette actually came from this technology, and the audio cassette and recorder were invented in 1965. Analog tape recording really dominated the majority of the 20th century. Even into the 21st century, major recording studios continued to use tape, and it is credited for a warm sound. It's a sound that you'll hear when you listen to old records and old vinyl. In the early 1970s, researchers for Philips began to experiment with optical disc technology. In 1980, the compact disc became the standard that was implemented from these technologies, and CDs became commercially available in 1982. In 1989, DigiDesign invented Sound Tools, which was a Mac-based two-track digital recording and editing system. Sound Tools was the first software-based recording program. And here we go again with another contribution, another revolution in recording. We go from analog tape to the invention of software-based and computer-based recording technologies. The price tag for Sound Tools, almost $4,000 at the time. In 1991, Sound Tools was renamed Pro Tools, and there are now numerous computer-based recording programs, from Logic Pro to Cubase to Sonar and on and on. And a lot has changed at this point. Computer-based recording is more efficient. You're able to handle editing functions and have much more efficient recording sessions using computers and software-based technologies. What is sound? We've established that recording is capturing sound so we can play it back at a later date. But what is sound? And basically, sound is vibrations that travel through the air or another medium, which could be water, solids, gases, and can be heard when they reach a person's or animal's ears. These vibrations are called sound pressure waves. So we can't see sound, but years ago, Bell Telephone Laboratories did some experiments and created a device that would allow us to see sound. And this is kind of what it looks like in this image here. Sound would come from a small horn, which is at the left of the image, travel through the device, and on the opposite end, you would see these sound waves. And if you look at them, they look a lot like the waves in a water if a stone or some other object was thrown into the water. So think of sound waves very much like you would think of water waves. They're basically these vibrations that happen when an acoustic generating device makes contact with the air. So again, sound is vibrations, and we call these vibrations sound pressure waves. Individual sounds, be they voices or instruments or animal sounds or any other sounds that we hear, they differ based on amplitude, frequency, and timbre. And these are the primary characteristics that help us distinguish one sound from another. Because think about it, sounds happen all around us every day, almost every waking moment. But our ears allow us to be able to distinguish, sounds of instruments from sounds of voices, from sounds of cars, and on and on. So let's start with amplitude. Amplitude is loudness. The acoustic intensity of sound pressure waves is called sound pressure level, or SPL. And we measure that SPL in decibels. So when we think of amplitude and loudness, think about the intensity of this loudness in terms of decibels. The intensity is the sound pressure level, which we measure in decibels. The threshold of sound is 0 dB. We don't really hear anything in our physical world until it would cross the threshold of sound. The threshold of pain is 125 to 130 decibels. And the threshold of pain is that point where you could actually cause damage to your ears if you're exposed to sounds at such loud levels, such as if you're in a club or in front of loudspeakers for an extended amount of time, you could really do some damage to your ears. Now, it is said that the ideal mixing level is 85 decibels, and that would be somewhat of a moderate listening level. And this is the level that you can listen to a piece of music over an extended period of time without causing ear fatigue. Many engineers would argue that they really prefer to mix at even lower levels than 85 decibels. I personally prefer to mix at levels fairly low for most of the time so I can hear the detail of all the sounds that are going into the mix. And then as time goes on throughout that mix, I'll turn the level up some, I'll turn it down some, and to really give me an idea of how all these sounds that I have in the mix are holding up at different volume levels. The next characteristic of sound that helps us distinguish one sound from another is frequency. And frequency is the rate at which a sound vibrates. And we measure frequency in hertz. So let's take a look at this little chart here. In this chart, we have an x-axis going across the bottom of the chart, a y-axis along the left side, and a center line, which goes right through the middle of the y-axis. Now, along this center line, I've drawn what's known as a cycle. A cycle is the smallest component of a sound pressure wave. And if we draw it out on this chart, it looks like a Z on its side or an S on its side. It will start at the center line, cross over the center line, go under it, and come back to the center line. This is one cycle. And these cycles are measured in increments of 1 second. And so if we were to look at this example here, this would be 1 cycle per second or 1 hertz. Let's look at another example. This would be a completely different sound. And if we look at its cycles, it has 3 of these individual cycles that happen over a second. So this sound would be 3 cycles per second or 3 hertz. Now, we don't hear sounds at that low of a pitch, because when you think of frequency, think of pitch. You know, the lower that frequency, the lower the tone of that sound is. But these examples help to make a couple of points about frequency. For starters, the frequency range of human hearing is from 20 hertz on the low end all the way up to 20 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz on the high end. And as you can see by looking at these charts, sounds that are on the lower end of the frequency spectrum tend to have bigger waves. So if we have 1 cycle per second, that's going to be a bigger wave than even 3 cycles per second. So imagine 20 cycles per second and how big those waves would be versus 20,000 of these cycles per second. So lower frequencies have larger waves, and they have slower waves and also longer waves. Higher frequencies have smaller waves, and they have faster and shorter waves. So even if you think about a speaker or a studio monitor has a larger subwoofer on the bottom half of the speaker, and it has a smaller tweeter on the top part of the speaker. That subwoofer is larger because it needs to be bigger for those larger low frequency waves to actually propagate through. And the tweeter, they're much smaller. No less important, but they're smaller because your higher frequencies are very small waves. They don't need as much space to actually propagate. The final primary characteristic of sounds that help us distinguish one from another is timbre. And timbre is tone color or tone quality. So timbre is what makes a particular sound different from another, even when they have the same pitch or frequency and loudness. So Two tones can, produce the same frequency, be the same loudness, but we are able to distinguish one from another because of the timbre. See, sounds produce a fundamental frequency, which is the lowest frequency or pitch in that sound. And sounds also possibly have a dominant frequency, which is a tone that is most heard by the sound, which may or may not be the fundamental frequency. There are also harmonics that exist within sounds. Harmonics are multiples of that fundamental frequency. So imagine a bass guitar. Let's say you're dealing with a bass guitar and the frequency is 80 hertz. And that's the tone of the fundamental tone of a bass guitar that you're dealing with. If you multiply that 80 hertz by 2, you get a harmonic of that bass. So tones have, or sounds have, harmonics. They also have partials, which are other tones that will exist within the sound. In addition, the way that a certain sound attacks or decays or sustains, they are all major aspects of the timbre. And so each individual sound generator, whether it's a trumpet or whether it's a guitar or a human voice, they have all these other aspects that go into the sound that really help make up the tone color or the tone quality of that sound. So let's examine some musical instruments, okay? Let's look at a trumpet and listen to that trumpet sound. Then let's move on to a violin. Very similar tone, similar amplitude, different instrument. Let's go to a flute and a guitar. And finally, a keyboard. Let's play that keyboard again. The guitar, flute, violin, and trumpet. So all of these instruments have distinct sounds. Now, they were virtually the same volume, and they were all playing the exact same tone. But the characteristics and the makeup of these instruments give them all a unique color or timbre. The trumpet is a brass instrument, the materials that it's composed of. The flute is a woodwind. The violin is a wooden stringed instrument. The guitar that you heard was an electric guitar, and then the keyboard was also an electronic keyboard. So the tonal color and the tone quality of a sound is what really gives it its unique sound. And so when we think about sound, we have to always consider those primary characteristics: the amplitude, which is loudness, the frequency, which is the rate of vibration, and the timbre, which is the tone color or the tone quality. So what is audio engineering? Audio engineering is the science and art of recording and reproducing sounds through mechanical, electronic, and digital means. It includes the processes of recording, editing, mixing, and mastering. Audio engineers work in recording studios, radio stations, film studios, and in venues where sound is recorded and reproduced. So when you think about live concert venues, you will most likely have an audio engineer on deck. Wherever you hear audio and sound, there at some stage was an audio engineer involved in the reproduction of those sounds. Audio engineering is a craft. It's a trade, and it takes many years of study. And that could be structured and or independent study and experience to fully understand and become proficient. There's so much information out there. We live in the information age. And an individual who is interested in becoming a better audio engineer really has a ton of resources out there to be able to do that. And that could be, again, at a structured recording school of some type, but it also could happen on an independent level. It's going to be the time that you put in. It's going to be the experience. And also any opportunities that one would have to spend with a professional audio engineer would really be a great resource to become better at the craft of audio engineering. Audio engineers must understand the fundamentals and traditions of the craft. And they also have to stay abreast of and in tune with technological advancements in the field. So understanding the fundamentals of sound and the traditions of recording are just as important as knowing what the latest technology is and what the latest advancements are. And the best audio engineers of today and of the future will really be a combination of both. They'll have the fundamentals under their belt, and they'll always be in tune with what's going on today. Audio engineers are responsible for recording and mixing and mastering music and audio so that it sounds accurate, consistent, and balanced based on the genre on a wide variety of mediums and listening sources. So people are going to listen to your recordings in their home and car stereos, on CDs, iPods, headphones, computer speakers, televisions. And it's important that no matter what source that your recordings are heard on, that the sound is consistent. It sounds balanced. And each genre is different. Hip hop music is going to be mixed much differently than jazz music, which will be mixed differently than rock and punk music, and so on and so forth. So as an engineer, it's important to understand, how each of these genres are mixed if you're working on them, and make sure that the mixes that you are making in your studio are consistent, and they're going to hold up on a number and a wide variety of mediums and listening sources. Our mix basically happens between two speakers. This is the canvas that we have to work in. And this is one of the reasons why engineering is not only seen as a science or a technical trade, it's also an art in and of itself, because just like a visual artist would have a white canvas with which to start a painting, as an audio engineer, we also have a canvas between those two speakers in which we're going to paint that sonic picture that we want to paint. So there's multiple dimensions that exist between these speakers. There's a left to right dimension, and we can manipulate and place items in this dimension using panning. And again, panning helps us to place sounds between the speakers. We listen in a stereo world. Stereo meaning two. We have two ears. Most of the time we listen on two speakers. So we're able to use panning to place sounds in the left part of the speakers, or the center or the right part of the speakers. Very similar to a visual artist who has a white canvas, they're probably going to use their space from left to right to really utilize the area that they have with which to paint. Another dimension is the top to bottom dimension. And this is basically perceived through frequency. So your lower frequency instruments appear in the bottom of the speakers, which again is where those subwoofers are. Those subwoofers are larger and are going to let your bass sounds, your lower frequency tones really propagate through. And the top part are your tweeters. And so therefore the perception is that the higher frequency sounds come from the upper parts of the speakers. Again, very similar to a visual artist. He or she is going to use that top to bottom as well to create a painting. And that's going to create a lot of interest. The more space that they use, the more interesting and maybe visually appealing that piece of art is going to be. The same holds true with audio engineering. Now, frequency is going to have a lot to do with the instrument selection or the instrumentation within a mix. So if you have a lot of bass and a lot of, say, the kick drum, and then we have things like hi-hats and maybe guitars and keyboards, you're going to really fill up that top to bottom perspective. A more sparse mix with less instrumentation may not necessarily fill it up as much, but that's where certain techniques with the equalizer can come into play to help manipulate the frequencies a little more. Then we have a front to back perspective. And our front to back dimension is really controlled by our use of volume. The louder something is, the more upfront or the closer it seems to be to the listener. The farther away that it seems to be, the quieter it would be. So as an engineer, if I want something to sound like it's far off in the distance, I'm going to make it a lot quieter than something that I want to be right up on the listener, which is going to be louder. And this is, again, similar to that visual artist. And the visual artist is going to, make images and objects a lot larger if they want us to have the perception that it's close to us. And they'll make images smaller if they want them to seem like they're in a distance. So these three dimensions combined with, if we get into effects, become other dimensions, such as using reverb to create the illusion of space and using delay to create echoes and, the illusion of manipulating time. So audio engineering, again, is as much a art as it is a craft. And we have these two speakers with which to manipulate our sound and our mixes, and we have various dimensions with which to manipulate. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Again, the fundamentals of sound are really critical to a deeper exploration into audio engineering and recording. In future videos, we will go much deeper into the equalizer and into the compressor and into some of the effects that were mentioned in this video. Until then, continue to record, continue to work hard and put time in. That is what's going to make you an engineer that will stand out from the rest of the field. Take care.